Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Howard Greenberg, and along with fellow board members Graham Akers and our two presenters, who are also board members, Jesse Gallagher and Roberto Boccoadoro, we're going to be your hosts today, and Jesse and Roberto are also presenting the main topic. So welcome. Hopefully everyone is doing well. Some of you I know are getting ready to go to Engage soon. I hope you have safe travels. Looks like it'll be a great time. So today we're going to cover a little bit business about OpenNTF. Oliver Lucy is going to talk about a new project we're starting up at OpenNTF called the Presentation Project. And then we're going to get into our presentation on One Touch Setup. And then at the end, we'll have questions and answers. So just wanted to have a big shout out to our sponsors, HCL and Prominic. HCL helps fund OpenNTF, and Prominic donates all the IT related equipment as well as services time to keep everything up and running. So thank you to both companies. Again, OpenNTF is community driven. I think as you'll see as we get into Oliver's presentation on the presentation project, we're looking for volunteers. There's all sorts of things that could be done. So as you can see on the screen, if you want to help with these or anything else you think you want to do, or just do your own project, or just get a hold of one of us, we'll be glad to help you get started. Okay, and turn things over to our chairman, Graham Akers. Graham, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, so Oliver's going to talk about the project as Howard just mentioned. I want to highlight though the future of OpenNTF. We recorded and posted a video on our YouTube channel last month that talks about work that we've mentioned in this webinar the last couple of times that's been ongoing for a while now, where the board is just taking a look at what it is that we do and can we do things better, differently? Can we add perhaps other ways to support the community? So I encourage everyone to go have a quick look at that video. It's short and sweet, and then join us in our Discord channel to offer your feedback. We're collecting feedback for the next couple of weeks from the community, and then in preparation for what we will tell you on the next slide is our annual general meeting at our next webinar time slot in June. We'll present our plans for the future of OpenNTF. So please do give that some quick thought and offer some ideas. Perhaps there's something on your mind that you've been wondering why we do it the way we do it, or if there was something that we could add. We'd love to get your feedback. Also, before I mention the next webinar, we have been promoting the design contest that our friends at Group Wave in Belgium have been promoting. There have been some entries received, and they are being reviewed by the panel right now, and they're going to be announced next week at Engage. And our goal is to have those projects highlighted on OpenNTF. So keep your eyes and ears open for that upcoming in the future as well. Quickly to wrap, so yeah, as I mentioned, we haven't had an annual general meeting for a while, and we've made a point of getting that back into the calendar. So our next webinar on June 16th will be an AGM. Really what we'll do is highlight kind of our operations from the last couple of years. As I said, we'll talk about our plans going forward as well, and we encourage everyone to join us and offer some feedback. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. Howard, back to you.
Thanks, Graham. And just a quick question for our attendees. I believe the annual general meeting we're going to do using GoToMeeting versus GoToWebinars?
Oh, yes, correct.
Okay, so no registration will be required. So just go to the link you see for more information, and that's probably where you'll go to attend as well. So it'll just be an open meeting using GoToMeeting, a slightly different version of the software, which will also allow for more engagement by you guys, by the everyone attending, versus a webinar like today. So just don't look for a registration link, but just look for the information on that page on the screen, and you'll see a lot more at OpenNTF.
We'll promote it through normal channels.
Okay, and Oliver, I think we're going to turn over to you for a few minutes. I can make you a presenter if you have something to show.
If you don't have the slides in this deck that we see right now, then I can present, of course.
Okay, I'm going to let you make you the presenter because I did not get any slides.
All right. So, broadcasting. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
All right. So, yeah, just a few words about that presentation project. We started that a while ago. Graham already told the story, the background of the idea in general. It is our goal to offer some curated and aggregated resources that hold presentations, materials of our kind that had been used and showed during the last decades in conferences, webcasts, and other events. And we are not only looking for physical files, but also for useful links where we can find stuff that we can see a video, for example. You don't have to upload a huge video to OpenNTF, obviously. But we want to make it a single place where you can search for resources. It is all about sharing the content that may also get lost over the time. And when we started that some months ago, we already saw the difficulties and the problems in collecting all this old stuff from the old days. Yeah? And that's something that will take some time to fill this vault of presentation materials. So there is the plan to collect everything on the OpenNTF website. There's already a little app available, a little submission app, which you can find under this link or by scanning this QR code. This little submission app is a Domino Vault app. It's a work in progress still, but you can work with it. And we already received several presentation materials and links from various persons we all know. Good stuff. And as far as I'm aware of, there is no limitation in file sizes and stuff like that. Anyway, this is only the, let's say, the first start and the first step to what we want to achieve. So the slide looks similar to the first one, but it's different. And as you can see, there is nothing in just collecting and hoarding stuff if you don't share it with others. So we are planning to create an application, a website, a web application incorporated into the OpenNTF offerings where you can search for everything that has been uploaded by others and curated by us or whoever wants to join to curate the stuff. Some kind of the idea of collaboration today, where we not only add links to blog posts, but we check them and filter them and categorize them and stuff like that. So that's basically the same with all the stuff that should be submitted by you. And of course, we need a UI for that application. And this is where the community comes into the place. It's all about finding ideas. First, we have to build a team to organize ourselves to find ideas, to scratch them down and maybe just build some little fancy stuff. And depending of how your personal workflow is and your personal preferences when you're starting a new project. For me, I can tell I would just start to code something and then let's see what how it goes, and share it with others, and you can join. But yeah, you may think different, and that's the dynamic in there. So we have a dedicated Slack channel right now. Apparently we have, I think, already a Discord channel too. I'm not sure.
We do.
Okay,
Yes, we do.
We have it. I think today it was created because we had some discussions about the name. It's not a fancy name, it's just a presentation project, so you will find it. And also there is something to start from if you want to play around with the application that is already there, the submission application, that Volt app. This is a QR code and the link to the GitHub repository, where you also find additional information on how you can join and contribute to the whole idea. So there is a bigger description, a more detailed description on that repo, and also the Vault app that we are using currently on the OpenNTF website, which is also linked in the corresponding channels on Slack and Discord, where you can upload stuff. And the only thing that I can ask for is, yeah, let's find together and contact me and contact others and spread the idea for all who do not know about this. And also recently, on Monday this week, Graham and I recorded a little video that you can also find on OpenNTF's YouTube channel, where we also discuss this idea a bit more in detail. And yeah, that's it from the presentation project, and I hope to see you there.
A couple of things to add quickly. Not just developers. This is an open source project that isn't just a development project. So people who are designers or just have an interest or have never been on an open source project and want to see what it's like, everybody is welcome. So no limitations from that perspective. And secondly, we've actually already had a question come in about this that I wanted to address directly. Christian asks, isn't the old stuff still copyrighted by the rights holder? Absolutely it is. Yes. Anything that is Lotusphere related, this was what Oliver referred to earlier about the first challenge that we ran into. So we're chasing down to try and get approval to be able to host materials that are copyrighted, but it isn't just the Lotusphere materials that we want to put on here. It's anything from any user group, which of course isn't copyrighted or may not be copyrighted. Let me correct myself. So where we definitely absolutely are paying attention to copyright of the rights holders, and we'll respect that. And as I say, we're trying to get permission to be able to host the IBM presentations, but in the short term, there's been a whole lot of user groups over the years where we are able to host those presentations. So for the time being, we've got a place to start, and we're working to be able to expand beyond that.
Right, and also it would be a good idea if we would not have 10 project managers and 1 developer. That would be a bit unfair. I would think about 10 developers and 1 project manager, maybe. Just saying.
Well said.
Okay, let me hopefully get the right screen there. Okay, good. So we'll go on to our main presentation, but first, if you want to ask any questions, so the way we do this, I think you all know by now. Yes, this will be recorded. It's always the first question. But they use the questions pane and go to webinar, which is highlighted on the screen. We will get to your questions verbally at the end. So we will not be answering questions in the questions pane, at least not for the most part. We sometimes break our own rules, but also please keep your questions related to the topics that are being discussed today. We don't know when Domino 13 is coming out. So hold that one for the HCL people at Engage next week. Okay, so on to our presentation. First up, I believe, is Roberto, who's going to talk about the One Touch setup, and then that'll be followed with Jesse, who's going to speak about the One Touch setup and how it can help developers. So let me make Roberto you the presenter. Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so thanks, Howard. So the topic of this webinar is One Touch Setup, a new feature introduced in Domino 12. I will cover briefly how does it work. It's very simple. And I'm going to use a Windows server to do the demo because the idea that I have had talking with people is that most people think that this is something related to the Docker Linux environment. No, One Touch Setup works with everything. And since most of the servers that at least my customers work with are Windows, I decided to use a Windows server to the demo. But this doesn't mean that it's in any way platform specific. And then I hand over to Jesse for the interesting part of the presentation. So what is One Touch Setup? As you can read, before V12, you had to run the server setup program, the graphical nice UI that asks you server name, admin name, and all the other information that you need to set up properly a server. And then click next, 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 and you had the server running. Now you can have either a file with environment variables or a JSON file, which is personally, I think, the best option, and refer to that when launching the server. You invoke this JSON file in the case that I will show, and it will take all the various things that you put in this file and will do whatever you say. So set up a server, set up an ID vault, create an application, update an application, set up configuration document, and there are tons of things that you can do with the JSON file. It's much more powerful than the env variables file. It gives you, for example, the ID vault can be created only using the JSON file, not the environment variable file. So there are 3 links in this page. First is the official documentation. The second and third are 2 examples. The third link is taken from my friend and fellow ambassador, Daniel Nashed, who made a sample JSON file for his Domino Linux setup. And that's a slightly modified version of this is what I will show you in the demo. So you can find an example here. The second link is another example taken from the official documentation where they not only create the server, but they create, if I got it correctly, a discussion database with a sample entries. So it gives you an idea, if you read through it, of how to create an application. So looking at those examples, plus in the official documentation, there are other examples for additional servers, because what I'm covering is the first server setup, but you can use the same One Touch Setup to set up an additional server. And there are examples there. So reading through that, you will be able to make yourself an idea of what can be done. And so now it's demo time. So I will fire up my virtual machine where I have nothing. Basically, there is no Domino installed. There is nothing. I just have an installation kit where I put the server. Let me show you the JSON file that I'm going to use so you can see what we're going through. Basically, we will set up the site server name, the task the server has to run, the network, name, IP address, whatever, port encryption, port compression, the organization. We create, obviously, an admin and put some stuff in the node sign AI. Then we think about security, deploy with anonymous access and the local admins. Then we create an ID vault with a specific name and the password and even the message. So for example, the password reset in my case is CJSF for a password reset. I am the admin, he's the developer. So it makes sense that I send the people to the developer for the password reset. And then I create a security settings, the vault settings, because you need to have a vault ID vault, you need to have the relative policy. Then in the names NSF, we will update some fields in the server. For example, we set up transactional log and DIOS, enable something on the HTTP, and set up the security cipher list in the ports section of the server document. Then we get the server configuration document, where in this case, let's look at internet lookup. We'll enforce the internet internet lookout, put it 7 tries on all the values that you need. Then we create a DOM CFG with the standard PWA login form. So this is just to tell you in advance what I'm going to do. So how does it work? It will work like this. It doesn't zip the files, and now it will start the installation. So, okay. Next, we obviously created the license. We have to select the directory where to install it. And those who know me knows that I hate file stuff. So I'm going to put it in Domino Data, and we'll install an enterprise server. There's one while it installs, I'll tell you something. As I said, it's a JSON file, and I don't like JSON. I don't like YAML. It's a mess. You have to be careful with spaces, indentation, and everything else. So writing by scratch a JSON file could not be the most easy thing in the world, especially if you're not a developer and you're not used to this kind of language, and that's my case. So what HCL has done, they put a nice, and I will show you, tool in the Domino directory that validates your JSON file. So before you run the setup and you get error in line 15, blah, 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 whatever that is, you can run this validate JSON program that will scan the file that you're going to feed the setup and will tell you, okay, JSON is valid, or in case, no, there's an error in line 55, blah, blah, blah. So you can check your files and correct it beforehand. So we have a server, but we haven't set it up. So I'm going to switch to Domino. And this is the tool, valid JSON, and I tell him, for example, this my setup file, it will scan and says it's valid. And then you say, sorry, you run the server, dash auto conf, and you auto conf, and you tell the file that you want to use. In my case, setup. It will check. No error, no error, no error, because the file is valid. And Now it will start, and there is the server that we have created. Obviously, there's an error because I didn't create a certificate, so it will set up the certificate manager application, but make this in a virtual machine, a sandbox without internet connection. It will not work, but nevertheless, you have a server running. We can close this. And now just have a look with the Domino Admin. So I have already installed. I am Mr. Admin, which was the name you have seen in the file. Yes. This is my password. I'm not gonna set up instant messaging. Next. That's it. So from the admin client, let's look at what we have. We have a server. Which is called with the values that I put in the JSON file that I showed you. For example, look at the ports. These are the value of the ciphers that we have set. It has enabled transactional logging. It has enabled DAOs. It has created the DOM-CFG NSF. It has created in the configuration document all the required stuff for internet lockout, 7 tries, 10 minutes, all the parameters that I put. So how long has it taken? 30 seconds. We have set up a server defining in advance in that file all whatever you want to do. So it's very, very, very easy, and it's very flexible because, and Jesse will show you to you in a minute, you can do more than just a basic setting, which is what I did now. You can create app, you can do more complex things. So that's basically all. That's it. It's very fast, very quick, and I'll hand it over to Jesse for the interesting part of this webinar. Thank you.
All right, well, I mean, now that it's set up as I have to do the interesting part of the webinar, I have a lot of pressure, but that's okay. So I'll talk about why this matters for developers, and to kind of set the tone. It's going to start out kind of simple and then get weird. Fortunately, the most important stuff is in the first couple of sections, but I do think that the weird stuff at the end is kind of what will be important long term. It'll get into things that are primarily things that I only do, but I think eventually everybody should do these kinds of things once things get a little easier, once things get a little smoother. So first, why does this matter for developers? The first reason is that it's the same reasons that it matters for admins. Most of us dip into Domino Admin eventually. You know, it's always been the case since the very beginning of Node Server, I imagine, that a lot of Domino developers are also the admins and vice versa. And so anything that makes an admin's life easier can also potentially make a developer's life easier. But secondarily, it gets into something that, you know, presumably a lot of us do, which is to easily create dev servers. So, you know, it's not like it's particularly difficult to install a Domino server, but having a standardized script, having something that's easy to just have and say, point at this, makes it all the better. So anything that makes these things easier, especially because there's so many, you know, as in Roberto's setup, he showed things like internet lockout and things like this, where all these like fiddly little settings that are easy to forget about. Just think of the security tab in the server document, where every single time you have to set up a server, you go in and go, oh, all of these settings are wrong. I need to change all of these. If you can put that into a standardized configuration file, you can avoid a lot of that hassle, and it makes it a lot easier, because the kind of stuff you have to manually do every time, well, you don't have to manually do it. Another big reason, and this kind of gets into some of these security settings and internet lockout and things like that, is consistency with production. So, this is something I'll be, diving into a little bit more later. But the closer your development server is to production, the better. So this can cover things like the HTTP heap size, whether or not Deos is involved. I mean, generally Deos is not important for developers, but what if it is? The more stuff you can get that's similar to what you're doing in production, the better. And having this be as kind of an externalized JSON file that you can look at and handle, rather than, oh, did I remember to set up X, Y, and Z? That's better. And you can combine this with Docker for an even better version of those. So as Roberto pointed out, none of this stuff with One Touch Setup is specific to Docker. It's definitely the case that Windows is a surprisingly popular server platform for Domino. So it's not specific to Docker, but I've kind of been very sold on Domino Docker deployments in various ways, and this ties in extraordinarily nicely with that. There are quite a few advantages you can derive from that, and combining these things makes it all the better. And then for the weird stuff we'll get to at the end, combine all of this stuff with automated tests, and you can do some very interesting things like that are particularly that can support many kinds of applications, but the more complicated your project, the more value you will get out of it. Which is why I've ended up diving into a lot of this kind of stuff. So I have a slide here that's kind of just references. The first one is the core documentation. So this page on HCL site. So if you do a search on Google for HCL Domino One Touch Setup, you'll end up here. This includes the reference for the JSON file, which we'll go into, and that honestly, reading through the tabular reference to this is a useful way to learn the things you can do. So there's lots of things that are not in this presentation that are present there. Just looking at that will get you a good idea of things like, creating databases, which I'll have a reference to later, and then you can, run agents at startup and various other things, and running different tasks and things like that. And it gets into here the very, very useful things you can set up. I also made a blog post about this a while ago. That one gets kind of weirder into the weeds, but it's a good reference for this sort of thing I'll be talking about. And then the main thing that will be useful if you decide to get into the integration test things is just looking at code, seeing how it's done. And so I've referenced the Jakarta EE support project I have. That's an open source place where I'm using this, and it's using it in basically as straightforward a way as possible. Things do get complicated in places, but that's kind of the nature of some of the things I'm doing there. But that is open source code that is available, and that can be a starting point if you decide your project setup is such that you will benefit from this. So talking a little bit about dev servers. So like I said, Domino isn't difficult to install, but doing this does smooth the process all the more. Since configuration is just in a JSON file, the more stuff you can get in there, the better. So, like I mentioned, the security tab of the server document, or there's the ports tab, things like saying enforce server access settings on HTTP and LDAP, etc. The more you can get in there, the more you don't have to remember to do manually, and the more consistent things will be from now on. So, if you just have that stuff written down, you don't have to remember to do it, because there are steps every single time I set up a new Domino server manually. There's something I forget, like, oh, did I set up the HTTP logging destination correctly? Did I make sure, did I just bind to the local address or not, etc. You can figure these things out. Like, it's easy to forget any number of these things, and so the more you can put in here, the better. Configuration documents in the names NSF are great. They can do a lot of these things. You can do a lot of notes INI settings there. I guess pretty much everything. And so, if you put things in configuration documents, you're not wrong to do so, because that is nice. That's nice distributed amongst your domain servers, and is available, and it's its own kind of documentation. So that's good. But not everything will go in there. So, server document things. So that's where specific HTTP protocol settings and things like that, and security access settings are not available in configuration docs. And so the fact that you'll have a new server doc created and it'll be wrong in a lot of ways, you can avoid that if you start with a standardized template for JSON. And since this is just a file on the file system, put it in Git. This should be in a repository. Like you can have your standard, whether it's just you or a team, have a repository, and whenever you make a change to your standardized settings, or you could have different files for different servers, you can make a commit, explain what you did, and have it tracked. And so if you decide you want to go back to something else, you have it there. Basically anytime you're dealing with a text file, it should be in Git. But there's not really much reason not to, because it's perfect for that. And tell your admins to do this. I know they will not want to. I know that they will look at you weird, but they should be doing it too. Git is not just for developers. Anytime you have this kind of configuration, anything that can be kept this way should be. So there's no reason why your admins can't have a GitHub repository or a self-hosted Git server or anything where they keep their configuration and their documentation. You can put it in NSF2 or however you want, but like keep this tracked in something. Like don't just copy it around only on your file system. That's one of the nice things about having these things. And I'll get to this a little bit with Docker as well. Like the more you can have configuration files that are on the file system, the more you can put into a version tracking system, even if you're not doing it in the same way that you would do like Java code or an ODP or anything like that. Like it's extremely powerful to just use Git in administrative circumstances. And you can also use this file to create commonly used dev databases. So Roberto showed in his example, he showed creating I think it was the iNotes redirect or the dom.config, one of those. Those are very common things that you might want to do on a new server. You can also do this where if you're carrying around the log reader from OpenNTF is a classic example of something where, particularly on a dev server, it's handy. I mean, it's good if you have it locked down on a production server as well. But have this as part of your initial setup. So say, here's all the rules for creating a server, and then have one of those blocks that he showed and is in the documentation, create the log reader as well. And you can set the ACL, you can sign it with admin P so everything will work nicely, and have that just be part of it. So that's something that pretty much all of us will want on our dev servers, and you may have your own kind of homegrown things at your company, things you've written, things other people at your company use. Have that as part of your deployment. So have a Git repository that has your JSON file, has copies of your NTFs that you like to deploy, and include all of this stuff as part of your server setup. Again, I mentioned consistency with production. So, production may differ from a normal dev server in a lot of little ways. So again, I keep harping on the server security tab just because I'm always annoyed about setting that thing up. But things like use of Deos and IF NSF, things like that, especially, something like, Deos and IF NSF, I don't generally run into trouble, but you can imagine a case where, oh, you're doing something weird, or there's a timing thing, something here or there. Maybe you're tracking down a bug, and if the distinction between dev and production is that dev is not using these because you don't generally by default, you may not notice it locally. So having these things be consistent, even though these things are primarily meant for larger servers with real heavy use, and as opposed to just one person or a small team, still you want consistency, because that way you will have a better idea of how things will work when they're deployed out to a real server. And then I mentioned you can include your standard deployed databases. So some of them are for dev uses, but you can imagine if you have a kind of standard corporate, there's always going to be your customized, app library or whatever. Have that on your dev server as well. Like if you include it as part of this, then you can be more confident that like the things you expect to be there will be there. And then you can make this a standardized thing. So that way, you don't forget things, or you don't assume something that isn't the case in production. Ideally, you will derive your configuration JSON from the one that your admin did for production. So, depending on how it's configured, maybe it could be the same one, or maybe you would at least say, okay, whenever there's a change to the upstream one, modify it here. Things get a little fiddly with that, but you really want it to say, here's our production one, and then derive dev from that, so that it can be based on that and keep up to date with it. So you don't want to, if you have to, you can just say, oh, well, I made one myself that's kind of like the production one, But ideally, you would be sharing this. So ideally, your entire organization would be bought into this, and then you would be able to derive from that. More easily said than done, but that's the goal. And then again, as a prelude to the next slide, things get all easier with Docker deployments. So I do want to talk a little bit about Docker deployments in relation to this. So again, this is not Docker specific. You never have to use Docker-based Domino or anything if you're using One Touch Setup, and you can get by just fine without ever worrying about Docker. That said, I personally am kind of out of the business of deploying Domino except in Docker. It's just so much nicer, and then this One Touch Setup synergizes, we'll say, so well with that. Like it's such a good clean match. Again, it's not necessary in either case. Like you can use Docker Domino without One Touch Setup, and you can use One Touch Setup without Docker Domino, but you'll be happier if you do both. So this is a natural fit for both production and development. So you can run production servers in Docker. You can run, I assume, I don't know if there's like a licensing thing, but you can run development servers in Docker. There are both the official FlexNet images that you can get, and then there's the the community scripts from GitHub. The ones on GitHub are a little better. They recently went through some nice upgrades. The FlexNet ones will generally do fine. There are a couple additional capabilities on the GitHub ones, and they just have more fit and finish and more polish than the official ones. I don't know why there's a distinction, there just is. But generally, unless you need one of the specific capabilities from the community script, which does have a little more overhead on you building it out of an installation, the FlexNet ones will do fine, but you may end up wanting something from the community script. So it's good to know about both, and it's good to know about the little differences. But pairing One Touch Setup with a Docker file like we have here, where I'm saying not just I want to deploy using this image, I want to derive from this image and copy certain things in. You can do things like in this screenshot, I'm copying in a Java policy file because you want to, for example, grant all permission to everything. You can have this be part of your Docker build. That's not something you can do, as far as I know, with the One Touch Setup file, but it is the same kind of, you're solving the same kind of problem where this is something you want consistently present on all of your servers. And so you can have this be part of your script. So you can say we have our repository that has our Docker file, we have our Domino config JSON file, we have our Java policy. And for example, here I'm saying copy the contents of the program directory. This was in a case where it's copying in a custom native add-in. So if you have a custom task or a custom Xmanager add-in, you can copy that stuff in too and make this part of your deployment, so keep things consistent. So if your company has a DSAPI filter you use, or you have a custom add-in or whatever, you can have that be part of this too. These things are not all related to the One Touch Setup, but they go so well together that I feel that it's worth talking about. You can also then combine this with Docker Compose. So this makes it easier, among other things. Actually, I guess first I should give a quick introduction to Docker Compose. I'm not a master at it, but the general idea is that Docker Compose is kind of one level of abstraction above Docker. And so what you'll do is you'll say, I want to describe one or more servers and associated volumes and networks and other Docker concepts, and combine those. So for example, you might want to have here, I'm saying I have a bunch of different volumes for the core data, the full text indexes, the NIF, NSF stuff, etc. And here I can declare in my compose file that I want to have all of these volumes. So this is a way that it makes it easier to be more like production, where you might have all of these things separated out, like have your view indexes and translog and things like that set up that you may not necessarily normally do on dev. But if you have a compose file like this, it makes it easier. So you just have all of these rules. And again, this is a text file. You can put this in a source control repository and keep it and say, this is our baseline for all of our development servers. Depending on what you're doing, this would also make it very easy to set up associated servers. So if, for example, your work involves, you work with a Postgres server, like you have Domino, but you're also dealing with data on Postgres, you could easily set that up as part of your compose and have them talk to each other. That's not normally something we as Domino developers and admins do. Domino is kind of a the monolith's monolith. Everything is just in there in one boat. However, maybe you'd set up Nginx, maybe you'd set up another service that you would want to associate with it. This will help you there. But even if you only have this one server, even if you only are using it to bring this up, this provides a couple extra nice capabilities on top of that will keep things clean for you, keep things consistent, and it removes one more bit of manual setup. So those are the general kind of ways that is like, if you're just running a server, you just want to have a server that you're using, you just want to create it and connect to it and do the things that one would normally do with a dev server. Like you copy your NSFs over there, you do your development, you point at it with Designer, etc. But then things can get weirder from there. Here's where the automation that these things can provide, the One Touch setup, the Docker deployments, etc., can really pay off in a way that's not necessarily natural to Domino developers, just because of the way history has brought us to where we are, but are extremely powerful. And if you can find a way to work this into your workflow, you will reap tremendous benefits from it, as I have. So I'm going to be talking about a project called Test Containers. This is an open source library for deploying temporary Docker containers during JUnit and probably other automated tests. So this is commonly used for if you have a Java library, and it works with a backend server, or you want to do Selenium testing, etc. This is the most common way, where you'd say, okay, I just need to have some server of some kind of Docker container set up, and you'd have test containers, and you say, give me a Postgres server, give me a MySQL server, give me whatever, give me an Nginx server, and it will set those up, it will run the tests, and it will bring them down. So it handles creating the containers, organizing them, handling port mappings, things like that, all in Java, and things work really nicely there. It's not as natural a fit for a lot of Domino things as those are, because, for example, if you're using a Postgres server, usually you're using it so that you can store data. You might be writing, custom add-ins for Postgres, in which case it would be weird there too. But a lot of the examples you'll see for test containers don't show the sort of things we'll be doing. But again, I promise you, you will get benefits if you end up going down this path. So this kind of setup pairs well with, and this is essentially a list of the things that I do. This pairs well with Mavenized OSGI plugins. So if you've done any of the Tycho stuff that I've talked about in the past, and you have automated builds with this sort of thing, you can build your OSGI plugins, you'll get your update site, and then as part of your test suites, you can create a Domino server with those OSGI plugins installed and run your tests against them. This also naturally fits with the NSF ODP tooling project. So if you have your ODP in a Maven project and you build it during your build, you can then deploy that in One Touch JSON and say, sign this with admin P, and then there's your NSF. So it could be an XPages application, it could be something that works with an OSGI thing, it could be a classic Notes web application, like anything that in this case would be accessible via HTTP can be tested there. So you could do, if you have a JavaScript app built, you could put that in there as well. And so you can have this NSF deployed and have a Domino server set up ready to test and then discard. And then this definitely pairs well with Selenium. So Selenium is a project that lets you do automated control of browsers. So Chrome and Firefox, and it supports others, although those are the two that matter here. This lets you run tests using those browsers. So you can point it at a URL, say, get the page, check to make sure some content is on there. So, for example, check to make sure that the app loaded up correctly. And then you can get really, really down into the weeds with controlling it and doing form back and forth and so forth. This all fits most naturally with HTTP-based tests, and that's where most of your examples will come from. So if you see other kind of app building and app testing things, you'll see them talking about HTTP primarily. But you could use this with other protocols. Like if you wanted to have Domino set up and use LDAP against it, or IMAP, you could. you're getting a little hypothetical as far as what you're doing, but for example, if you are developing a custom add-in and that as an extra port, you could test that too. So if you're getting into native development with Domino, this can also help you there. So test containers, the way this setup works is that you can use a Docker file, you can use Java-based configuration, or both. I'll show you a little bit more of this. This would get pretty complicated for a slide, but you can just say start with the HCL com/Domino Docker image, or the more complicated name from FlexNet, and start from there. Or you can have your own Docker file like what I had earlier, where you would have kind of your basics set up, like if it's copying in the Java policy and copying in your native extension or what have you. You can use those, and you can also do some of this stuff programmatically. You can reference project resources. So for example, if in your test suite you have a bunch of test data that you have an agent that will import it in, or something, you can include that and have it referenced in there. This is convenient because a lot of the times you're going to want test data, and this will let you add it into your Docker container as it goes. You can also derive the Maven version to find the built update site, just because these things can get kind of loosely bound. You can also use file system bindings. So if you're familiar with Docker, you know that you can either add things to the container, and then have that present, or you can have a binding to your local file system. So if you're working locally, this sometimes is better, sometimes is worse. It all, it depends, and that kind of gets into its own topic to do with Docker. I mentioned how one might do OSGI deployments. So normally when you're deploying OSGI plugins to a Domino server, there's the two main ways to do it. The common good way for normal deployment is to use an NSF-based update site, because then you can replicate that between servers, and you can have it do access control, and you can see the stuff easily. You don't have to work with the file system. It is wonderful, and you should generally be doing that. But if you were doing an automated test, you don't care about those benefits. You don't care about replicating between other servers, and you don't care about being able to see it in the nodes client, because this Domino server is going to be destroyed at the end of the test. It can be a little tricky though, because the way you would normally deploy it to the file system is in the data directory, but the official image doesn't really have a way, like the way it works and the way it deals with the data directory doesn't let you just put files in there. The community image does have a workaround for this, but the timing of that one gets a little fiddly, so it doesn't really work perfectly. So what I ended up doing in my case, and if you are interested in doing this, probably the best way to work with it would be to look at the code. So I have that horrifying looking link at the bottom there. And so you can use the way that Equinox works with update sites and deployments to have a link to this. So the gist of this process, which is admittedly arcane, is that you will deploy your update site, put it into your container, tell the Domino server to point to it, and then those will be present during HTTP start at the very beginning. And so you will have those in your first launch. So if you're deploying, say, a OSGI-based web app, you will just have that there and it will be available. If you're deploying an XPages library, it will be available at first start. You don't need to worry about restarting the server a second time or anything like that. Now, container initialization for Domino is a little interesting. So if you're doing automated tests, you can't run the tests until Domino is fully started. And so while Domino can start up fairly quickly when it's paired down with the One Touch setup script, it still does take time, and you need to figure out a way for your tests to know, has Domino started yet? Like, can I be confident that the stuff that I need to test will actually be there? So normally you would do something like test containers calls them wait strategies, where you'd say, I just want to wait for a port to be available. However, having just a port available for HTTP, for example, is not sufficient with this kind of setup, because, for example, if you use the ability to have admin P sign a database, that may have happened by the time HTTP started. It may not have. There's no guarantee of order. Like, all these things just happen when Domino feels like it wanted them to happen. So you can do things, for example, for that, you can look for a certain number of times that it said adding sign bit, which is the message that you get from admin P signing a database. You might have a post install script in an agent. So if you have your One Touch setup set to run an agent on server launch, you might have a message that says, okay, I'm done. Like if it was, doing some kind of programmatic post install setup, importing test data, etc. You could look for that too. And so generally you'll want to combine all of these things and look for multiple things. You want to make sure HTTP is started. You want to make sure that admin P has signed the databases that you're going to be testing. And you want to make sure any of your custom stuff is done. If you're using the community image, you'll want to set the Domino Docker std out environment variable to yes, so that way all of the console messages will actually be present on the Domino on the containers console for test containers to look for. Once you have all this stuff set up, you'll probably want to access URLs. So again, this would be if you're testing your X pages or classic web application, testing your OSGI based web app or what have you. So in my case, in here where I have the test suites for the Jakarta EE support, I want to be able to test that JAX-RS is working and test that all these things are available. The way Docker works is that you will have this created image and then test containers provides methods to say, get me the host name that it's using locally and get me whatever port it's mapped to. So you'll say, I want to expose port 80. That will be mapped to port 57029 or whatever, some random effectively number. And you can get that programmatically and say, just give me the host name, just give me the first map port, so you don't have to tie it in there. So that way you'll be able to say, if I'm doing a local call to my container to run these tests, you can get the network information that way and you'll be able to access your application. Once you have that, you can just do, some of these, I'll say, starts out simple after I went through all of that nightmare. You'll have sort of simple tests here where you'd say, I just want to get the baseline URL and test sample. Just make sure it works. Make sure that you get back some basic sort of thing. I tend to use the JAX-RS client API. There are other things like the Apache HTTP client. You could use HTTP URL connection from core Java as well. Or if you happen to be using a newer version of Java, you can use the HTTP client that comes with that. And once you have this stuff built up, you can say, give me a client, point at this URL, get it, and go from there. And then this is how I use all this stuff. So this is how I get into making sure that something I did in Jakarta EE didn't break JAX-RS, it didn't break CDI, it didn't break something else. And can start out simple. You might then want to get into Selenium containers. So I mentioned that you can run Chrome and Firefox headlessly in these containers. Normally Selenium would be kind of annoying to set up, but using test containers pairs perfectly with this, because then you can say point this browser to my freshly created destroyable Domino container and get all this information. And like do your web-based tests, do your UI tests. You can do screen recording, etc. It gets very interesting and very powerful. You would need to do a little more setup, saying I want to create a bridge network between all of these things, and then give your Domino container a name so that you can look at it and have these know each other. This is all. This is kind of just the way that Domino or Docker containers can communicate with each other. So you'll just have to kind of know the difference there. But then once you have this, you can do much more powerful stuff. So this example here is showing a JSF, testing the JSF capabilities that I added to the Jakarta EE support, but you could easily do this. Well, you could do this as well with an X page. So if you wanted to make sure, hey, when a user goes to this page, they should have a login form. When you, if you set up a user in your One Touch setup configuration, you should be able to test that login. Go to the login, tell the browser to type in the username and password, hit submit, make sure that it redirects you to a new page, and then actually do this flow. Like you can actually programmatically do the web flow of your application and make sure all of this stuff works. Like if you know what kind of stuff you should see, you can find this stuff, and you can look for elements on the page. You can look for class names, things like that. So it's a long walk to get here for sure, but these things do all kind of come together here, and then you get the benefit of something that we don't normally have. which is that you can do full testing end-to-end of Domino-based applications and test XPages applications and run this stuff on a testing server. And it definitely does get into the weeds here, but this is, you do derive these benefits. And you can do this across multiple browsers. So usually, an application will probably look fine in multiple browsers, but sometimes, Chrome renders something differently than Firefox does, or there's a JavaScript bug in your code that is fine in one browser and not fine in another one. And so this is a way that you can provide multiple browsers to this. So this is handy. You do get Chrome and Firefox out of the container, and those are usually the ones you need. If you wanted to, you could combine it with other browsers if they're available, but things get weird. But I kind of want to just say, I'm aware that all of this gets very arcane and very strange and very unnatural to a lot of Domino stuff. And this presentation has walked a long way away from One Touch Setup. But the reason why all of this is in here, and the reason why I think it's important, is that these are the sorts of benefits that you can eventually derive from One Touch Setup. So it starts out as saying, I just want to set up a Domino server on Windows, and things are nice and easy, and it saves you some hassle. And then it turns into, now I have created dev servers that are consistent with production. You keep your NIF, NSF settings the same. You keep your DEOS settings the same. Now you have a better match to what you have in production. The next level is, now I'm doing this with Docker. Now our production servers and dev servers use the same setup, and we have our configuration stored in a Git repository, and it's consistent, and we're deriving things, and now we have things that are more explicable and more self-documented, and you have all of these additional benefits that you didn't have before. And then once you have these things in place, now you can say, well, if we have all of these things, we have a consistent setup, we have something that will be representative of production, and we have this that we can easily just create with One Touch. Well, a test suite can do that. One Touch can run these things, can build these servers for you, and you can have it consistent. You'll know the users you're setting up, you know the settings you've set up, you know the apps you've deployed, you know that admin P has signed them, you know that you run a post-install agent, all these things happening thanks to the One Touch setup. And then you can start reaping benefits from that. You don't need to set up a special test server if you have automated tests. You don't need to set up all these things manually. You don't need to worry about, oh, the data was corrupted from the last test, because it's created anew every single time. You get these benefits of Docker, even though technically One Touch Setup has nothing to do with any of this. It's just, this is an enabling thing. This will give you these things, and it's something that you couldn't necessarily do without all of these other things in place. I mean, some of it you could, but this is a new thing. This is a new capability, and my hope is that in time, either Domino will change or I will write cleaner scripts and things like that to make it easier, because I think this is something that should be more readily doable, and not require quite as much arcane knowledge as it does currently. But the goal is that if you're writing apps, you should be able to test them. You should be able to do automated browser tests, make sure things load up, make sure all this stuff happens. And One Touch Setup helps get us there. And there are more capabilities than this. There are more interesting things you can do, but this is just an example of kind of like some of the furthest places that I've taken this so far. And I think it's been very important. And now I have, I have used this to prevent regression bugs, and that's something that we don't have with Domino otherwise, and this is a big improvement. So that's kind of what I have to say about this. I will, if you are interested in this, like I was saying, I think looking at the slides will be potentially, or looking at the slides and the linked code will probably be a little more useful than just hearing me go over it, because it is very weird if you haven't done this stuff before. But I think it'll be useful to have this available, have this in the presentation project, and I think this is a good path that as our tools improve, and One Touch Setup is a key component of that, we will be able to get to this stuff a little more readily. So I think that with that, I can turn it over to the questions that we have.
Well, thanks, Jesse, and thanks, Roberto. Let me take over the presentation.
I think as you're doing that, I'll follow up on Jesse's comments. Jump into the Discord chat and let us know if this is of interest, and how we can provide more information about this if that's something that you want to do. You know, these webinars are certainly intended to share information, but also to generate conversation and help learning. And if there's more things that we can do to follow up or engage in maybe some online, what were we calling them? Anyway, you know, group of people sitting around and looking at some code. Maybe Jesse can volunteer to walk us through some stuff so that we can share ideas and learn more. But anyway, Howard, over to you with questions.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Yeah, just a reminder, you can ask questions in the questions pane. We have a couple questions queued up already. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. The first one's from Dominique. Will you cover the case of adding an extra Domino server? So is that something that is easy to do, or?
Yeah, I'll take that. Yes, the answer is yes. If you go into the links that I put in my slides and look at the examples, there are examples for the first Domino server setup, which is what I showed, but there are also examples for additional server setup, which is also a thing that Jesse covered because he doesn't create a single server in his environment. So yeah, there are some JSON examples there for minimal to full, and as I said, then you have just to understand how the JSON file is built and change it to create your additional service. This One Touch Setup covers both first and additional.
Okay, thanks, Roberto. And then I have a question from Daniel. What about a silent installation on Windows? Do you have any experience with this?
Personally, I haven't tried the silent installation with One Touch Setup. I would need to test it and tell you something. I haven't tried.
Okay, thanks, Roberto. I think that is it for our questions that we have so far. Let's see, anyone else have any questions? Going once, twice? I think that's it, guys. Seems to be all our questions. Any last comments?
Separate from the webinar, a reminder that there are going to be some OpenNTF sessions at Engage. Roberto, you've got one, we've got a roundtable, right?
Yes, I will. I have more than one, but important for OpenNTF is that me and Sardar, which is another member of the board, will have a happy OpenNTF happy hour roundtable where we will be there to answer your questions and collect your feedback on all the activities that Graham talked about. So what are we planning to do? If you have questions on the presentation project, if you have any questions or suggestions for us, me and Sardar will host a roundtable and we'll listen to you.
And Paul Withers is planning on joining that too, if I'm not mistaken.
Sorry, both, yes.
Yeah, and you're right. And Sardar has a separate presentation as well. So
there is for OpenNTF another bit, because on Wednesday, I think, morning, there is the presentation where we will show the results of the contest that we mentioned at the beginning of the session.
Yeah, excellent.
Today we have done the selection. I have the results, but I'm not going to tell anything now. So we will show this together, OpenNTF and Group Wave at the session at Engage.
Great. Well, I hope everybody at Engage has a good time. I think we can wrap it up, Howard.
Okay. Well, thanks, Graham. Well, thanks to our presenters today and to Oliver for talking about the presentation project. We look forward to seeing everyone at our annual meeting next month. And until then, have a great great rest of your day and take care.